Okay, so this video is the first of the videos for the social interaction topic here. And in this video, we're just going to look at kind of key components of social interaction, which are an aspect of the social structure, which will just focus on statuses and roles. Before that, I'll just remind you of the outcomes and the key terms in Brightspace on the read section of the course this week here. And I'm not going to read through it here in the video. You can read the information in the introduction and part for this week, which is week 6 here. So make sure you read this little story, the actual story, a news story involving a former premier of Alberta, Ralph Klein. And I have this one a question to consider. It's here on the slide as well. So making sure you've done that. I'm not going to necessarily ask you questions in this video like I have with some previous videos, but having this story in mind as we go through this concept will be really helpful in reinforcing some of these concepts here. And wanted to sort of say that I wanted to use this particular story involving an interaction with homeless individuals here because this is a really good way, sad way, but a really good way to provide an example of how social problems occur and how they may be reinforced and allowed to continue within our social structure, within our society, and within specifically the patterns of interactions that people have with one another. So I'm going to entrust you with the task of, throughout all of this, with the task of identifying how homelessness as a social problem is perpetuated, is reinforced within our social structure, using the ideas, the concepts identified in this chapter. The structure of society, as we've looked at before, is essential for the survival of a society and for the well-being of each individual within it, because the social structure provides a web of things like familial support, support of family and friend and community. It provides a web of social relationships that connect us to each other, that connect each of us to the larger society. And many homeless people have lost this vital linkage. They don't have family support. They don't have social relationships that, help them in that way. As a result, they often experience a loss of personal dignity, a sense of moral worth, and a sense of a moral worth because of their homeless condition. As one person, and it was in that particular story, one of the homeless individuals who encountered the premier that night, noted it's demeaning to be treated as zero. So the stereotypical image that we have in our society, in our culture, of the homeless person who's, we not only we think that they're homeless, we think they're less worthy, we think they're lazy, we might assume that they're alcoholics or drug addicts. When we look at that, when we critically look at, the state and the experience of homeless individuals today, it's far from an accurate reflection of our country's homeless population. So with an example like the one I've started this topic with here, sociologists raise specific questions, and some of what we're going to cover in this chapter, this topic, are some ways that you can explore this. But sociologists have, in response to Premier Klein's actions this one night, ask questions like, was Premier Klein's reaction to homelessness a response shared by the majority of Albertans? What would Canadians from other provinces think of his behavior? Is his behavior justifiable? Homelessness is a social problem that evokes strong reactions from some, a neutral response from others, an annoyed or angry response from still others. So that's why I'm asking you questions to think about and reflect on, like how do you respond when you're approached by a homeless person asking, say, for spare change? What thoughts run through your mind? So this links up to this topic's concepts here. Sociologists have studied social patterns that many people share. As C. Wright Mills wrote over 50 years ago, probably, if one person is unemployed, it's a personal problem. But if thousands of people are unemployed or homeless, that difficulty then is a social problem in addition to being an individual trouble. So sociologists look for the root causes of such social patterns in the way society is organized, and here specifically in that social structure of society. That is where they look for the cause of social problems. So a basic premise of the sociological inquiry is that human societies, regardless of time, culture, geographical location, they're characterized by some discernible structure. Human social interactions are ordered, they're patterned, they're predictable, and therefore they are structured. So the social structure works to limit human freedom and individual agency to act in certain ways, but it also frees us up to act in ways by enabling us to coordinate our actions with those of other people. It allows us to anticipate how other people are going to act in a given situation. It reduces some of the guesswork in social encounters, and it makes social interaction more orderly and predictable. So in this way, what we're going to look at here is that component of social structure that's made up of statuses and roles, social groups, and social institutions. Now, in this particular topic, we're not going to talk a lot about social groups or social institutions. We have a topic later on in the course where we will talk about social groups and organizations, and so we'll come back to that. So we're just going to focus on statuses and roles here. But this is, I just wanted you, they all connect to one another in really important ways. And this is the framework, statuses and roles, plus social groups, plus social institutions. This is the framework in which we interact with others. And the combination of these things provide the basic framework for what we call society. So let's define statuses and roles. So the social structure of society includes social positions, the relationships amongst these positions, and the kinds of resources that are attached to each of those positions. Now, I want you to take a moment, and after I've asked a question, feel free to pause the video so you could write some of this down. And I will encourage you to write this down, but take a moment and think about how you would answer the question, who am I? What would you create a list that sort of defines who you are? Okay. And make it, don't, for this purposes, no personality, no feeling. So who am I? Well, I'm sad. You know, that's important, but not at this particular moment. But who are you? So I know that you are at least a student because you're taking this particular class, just like I am a teacher. So what else would you add to that list of who you are? When you've got a few, hopefully there's more than one there. There definitely will be more than one thing there. So once you have that, you know, start the video up again, and I'll get you to come back to those things. Now, to determine who you are, in order to answer that question, who am I, you must think about your social identity, which is derived from the statuses that you occupy, and it's based upon what we call your status set. Or status set is the totality of all the statuses that you occupy. So a status functions as a social address. It tells people where an individual fits in society. And knowing a person's status tells you something about how that person is likely going to behave towards you and how you are expected to behave in response to them. So, for example, your status as a student tells you something about how you should behave when you are around and with your teachers or your instructors, and how you should expect them to interact and behave around you, given that they're teachers and you're the student. Now, there's different types of statuses. We have two different types of statuses. We have what are called ascribed statuses. An ascribed status is a position, a social position typically conferred upon birth. So you're born with this, or you receive it involuntarily later in life. So it's something you don't have any control over. And it's based upon attributes over which you have little or no control over. So an ascribed status conferred at birth is your the fact that you are the child to parents. So you are the child, and your relationship to your parents, that is something you had no control over. Similarly, your racial background, your ethnic background is also something that is involuntary, conferred at birth. Now, an achieved status, another ascribed status is your age. And so that's something obviously you get at birth, but you have no control. You are going to age, and each year you're going to get older and older. And so that is also something you don't have any control over, is your age. Now, an achieved status, the other type of status, is a social position a person assumes voluntarily, or it's the result of personal choice or just direct effort. You work at it, and you voluntarily choose to take on this particular status. And so your status as a student would in some way be mostly an achieved status, where you might not be your choice to, be a student at this particular point. You do put in effort to be that student. And if you didn't, you would drop out, and therefore then you wouldn't be a student in that way. Likewise, the example I was giving, I'm an instructor, I'm a teacher, and I voluntarily chose this. I put in effort, and it is so that is my achieved status. And there's going to be some statuses that nope, I forget what I was going to say there. So what I would say, so I'll ask you now to go back to your list of answers to who am I, and see if you can label the different ascribed statuses, that which ones are ascribed statuses and which one are achieved statuses. And I'll let you know that Little does give you some examples of some of the different types of, what is an ascribed, what is an achieved status. I've just given you a couple of different examples here. Now, ascribed statuses have significant influence on the achieved statuses that we occupy. So, for example, one's ethnicity or race, one's age will affect each person's opportunity to acquire certain achieved statuses. So a person of a more privileged race or age are going to have more opportunities to realize desirable achieved statuses than someone without such an advantage. So that is the whole reason we talk about often, for example, racial discrimination, and people, because of their race, they are not given the same opportunities. For example, they might not be hired at a job, even if they do have all the right qualifications, because of bias on the part of who's doing the hiring will then deny them that opportunity, so they can't move into a particular career or profession as easily as someone of a different race. Similarly, your age is as an ascribed status, and by virtue of your age, we actually do have rules and laws that you can do things and not do things at certain times, and likewise, that does affect your ability to move on to desirable achieved statuses, at least until your age changes. So again, looking at your list, a question what I would ask you to do is look at, see if you can find an example of one of your ascribed statuses, likely now or maybe in the future, affecting an achieved status in that particular way. Now, each person holds many different statuses at any given time. We occupy many different positions in that way. Some of those statuses are going to indicate and be symbolic of higher social positions, and some are going to be maybe of lower social positions. So how is one's overall social position viewed by others in light of the fact that one person might have conflicting statuses? So for that, we introduce the concept of master status, in that given our status set, sometimes some of those statuses are viewed as more important and more significant by society, and then we use those as kind of the only thing or the main thing we look at when we are interacting with a certain person. So a master status is a status that has exceptional importance for social identity. It shapes and determines the relationships and interactions we have, if not sometimes their entire life, given the power of the master status. So an example would be the concept of master status is mostly considered when we think about negative statuses. And it's really clearly a good example when we think of the criminal status. So someone has achieved the status of criminal because they have engaged in a decision, they've made a personal choice to engage in a crime, commit a crime. So now they have that master status once they've been found guilty, of course. And they have and so that criminal status will, as a master status, overshadow all of the other social characteristics, all of the other statuses that they have. The criminal status is, a stigmatizing status. Again, it's very negative, and how we use it as people within society is we use it to, we make really unfair assumptions then, particularly if a person, say, has committed a crime, therefore they're a criminal, we then assume they have other negative and undesirable statuses. So, for example, often, when we are, thinking about or being told about a criminal, we assume that, oh, well, they're also a drug addict, or they're alcoholic, or they're just lazy and they don't want to do legitimate work. So we ignore any other positive statuses about them and treat them just as if they were only that one status. And when it's negative, that then means the interactions are likewise negative. Now, in that introductory story I told you about Rolf Klein visiting the homeless shelter there, there was one of the men that was residing in that shelter that night. His name is Mark Shea. And he actually was the guy that went to the media the next day to tell them Premier stopped in last night and did some horrible things. But in his interview, in Mark Shea's interview, he sort of, in the quote on the board here, on the slide here, is reflective of this power of a stigmatizing master status. And so he noted that, it was a challenge, and he's talking about his life when he was homeless and was a resident of that center for a bit. He said it was a challenge to prove not everybody who goes there is a bum and should be labeled. So this idea, again, being homeless is a negative master status that we assume that those people who are homeless are lazy or a bum or they're drug addicts and they're losers, and that then informs how we see them, and ultimately then treat them. And we'll get to that part of this in the next video here. Okay, the other part of statuses are roles. So each status that we hold designates a social position in society, and attached to each of those statuses is a set of behavioral expectations, which we call a role. So think of it as like, and I've got sort of the, we use the language of the theater here in this way. So a role, it's just that, like an actor has a role in a script and expectations for how they should perform that role. That's what a role is. So throughout our lifetime of establishing identities, we act out numerous roles in the game of life by playing out organized scripts in the form of normative expectations. So where we occupy a status is a position. We occupy a status, we play a role, and that role is what's been dictated by society for that position, for that status. So the term role is borrowed from the language of the theater. It conveys the understanding that in performing or playing their roles, most people behave according to the dictates of society or society's script. Not only do the roles we play dictate the kinds of actions we might take, they also prescribe appropriate emotions and beliefs and attitudes that accompany those actions. So we'll use the role of a student here as an example. Any given role is made up of two parts. And that is, one is the role expectation. And the role expectation is a group or society's definition of the way a specific role ought to be played. So the expectation is that script. And so think of that in terms of how are you expected to act as a student in the classroom or in relationships and interactions with your teachers and so on. So the role expectation or the script, and then the second part of the role is the actual role performance. This is how a person actually performs the role. And this is where you as an individual kind of comes into play, and it's the actual, how are you living up to those expectations? Sometimes you're going to perform the script perfectly, exactly, how you think it should be done. Sometimes you're going to have some problems, or sometimes you might want to ad lib and just kind of go off script in that way. So there's the script and then the actual performance. And so I should note, this is why I have these images here. I was trying to find images of, theater and actors and that sort of stuff. And I'm currently obsessed with, and I came to it much later than the rest of the world did, but I'm obsessed with the Hamilton, the musical Hamilton. And so that's why I've included these images here. So it's a theater, a play. The role expectation is the script that was written for all of these particular characters, and what they are to say and sing and that sort of thing, and where. And then there was the actual performance in how the specific actor in each of the roles played that role. And these are stills from the kind of the main sort of, the key and probably most celebrated cast of Hamilton, the original Broadway one, but they're not still performing this, but the Hamilton still is running in various cities. And so each actor in each role is going to be playing that role just a little bit differently. Those performances are going to be varied, but they still are going to adhere to the specific script in place. Now, one couple other last aspects about roles here. In giving your performance in any of the roles that you're playing, you're going to utilize status symbols, kind of like props in a play. Status symbols, much like props in the theater, status symbols are the visible external signs of one's social position and an indicator of their status. And so as a student, you know, there's certain status symbols and props that you use. You know, you got books, you have a backpack, and you take notes and that sort of thing. Status symbols, though, can also be stigmas. They can symbolize a stigmatized or devalued status of the individual, if not always, but maybe in certain contexts as well. So for example, think of a student who goes into a convenience store with their backpack on. That backpack in that setting is going to be a stigma, and very likely they could either be then very closely watched by security or the staff, or asked to take off that backpack, that status symbol, because of the accusation or assumption that that student might try and shoplift in that store. Now, lastly here, we have in performing the role and getting to that role performance is going to be affected by a couple of things. One is going to be affected by what we call role conflict. And role conflict is when incompatible role demands are placed upon a person by two or more of their statuses that they're holding at the same time. And so it's when, you know, and I chose this image here on the screen, it's kind of like you're being pulled into two different directions by two or more of your statuses. So think about what might produce role conflict for you as a student. So student is one of your statuses, but might you have another status that then conflicts with you being able to perform well your role as a student? So for example, do you have family obligations that sometimes, you know, overlap with or get in the way of you being a student? Or maybe you have a part-time job, or you have a whole host of chores that you might have to do at home. And so those, you know, you're thinking about even just the time you have to do your role, your performance as a student, is there something getting in the way of that? Now, the other thing that impacts on role performance would be role strain. And this is when incompatible demands are built into a single status. So it's just that one status, and yet it is, if you were to play that role perfectly and adhere to the script perfectly, you can't do it. It's, you know, sometimes virtually impossible, if not difficult. So when you think about the role of a student, what might cause strain in that role? And that's where you sort of think about, you know, all of the, you know, the expectations of being a student. So for example, as a student, you're expected to do well on tests and assignments. But as a student, you're also supposed to be respectful and polite and maybe even quiet in class and not question your teacher. But if you're not sure of, you know, some information and you want to ask questions, but again, that expectation that students are polite and quiet in class is getting in the way of you doing well on the test because you can't ask questions. Similarly, your role as a student, you're in multiple classes. And so it might come a time when the work that you have to do for one class is getting in the way of the work that you need to do for another class. Or the, you know, extracurricular activities you do at school, say play sports, might get in the way of your studying and doing work for your academic classes there. So role strain is just incompatible demands within one single status, conflict two or more statuses. So I'll end the video here by just bringing to your attention the journal post questions. As always, we have this one first question, which has you going back to that current issue or event from journal post 1, question 1, and see if you can use any of the information from the social interaction topic to explain, understand a bit of that issue or event, or even just ask questions in that regard. So for material that we just covered, do statuses, roles, role conflict at all, work into this here. All right.